Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. Today, I'm pleased to welcome a fellow insect reproductive biologist to the show. Dr. Nathan Burke is a Marie Curie postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Hamburg in Germany. As an evolutionary and behavioral ecologist, he's interested in understanding the evolution of sex differences in animal behavior and reproductive strategies. So he's really perfect for our show. Welcome, Nathan. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here.
Could you please start by telling me what general area of reproductive biology your research focuses on?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I am an evolutionary and behavioral ecologist. So that's my field. I'm interested in how the evolution of traits and behaviors depends on the relationships between organisms and other organisms and organisms and their environment. So more specifically than that, as you mentioned, I'm interested in the evolution of sex differences, whether those are behavioral traits or reproductive strategies. Yeah.
Very cool. And I'm curious about your journey through STEM. How did you first get interested in studying science? What experiences encouraged or discouraged you? And what were some of the biggest hurdles or obstacles you faced?
Yeah, so getting interested in science, I think it started at a young age. As a very small child, my dream was to be a crazy mad scientist, and I would draw these little pictures
I love
of
that.
mad scientists with fuzzy hair and doing chemical experiments.
That's awesome.
It started from a really early age, and family members used to call me Albert as a funny nickname after Albert Einstein.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, the science connection was really strong from that very early age.
Mhm.
But interestingly, that didn't persist. As a teenager, I absolutely hated science with a passion in high school.
Interesting. What
Yeah,
made you
and
switch to hating it from loving it?
I think I just didn't find it interesting, the way I suppose that science was taught.
Mm.
And it didn't capture my attention and curiosity sitting in a classroom and listening to teachers. So yeah, I think that's part of the reason it didn't persist. I was more of a arty kind of guy. I actually originally studied fine arts at university when I left
Oh,
school.
cool.
I wanted to be a painter. So yeah, really, I'm more surprised than anybody that I turned out to be a scientist. Yeah,
So, how did you get back? How did you circle back to science after that?
I suppose my trajectory has taken a really wide arc to get here. After art school fell through, I thought I wanted to be a high school teacher. And then I became interested in sustainability and self-sufficiency. And I became a cheesemaker and
Very cool.
then a horticulturist growing plants for a
Wow.
nursery. I came to science really late.
Mhm.
It was when I was studying horticulture and permaculture, actually, that I realized how deeply I wanted to know things. I would ask my teachers these questions about photosynthesis or ecological principles, and they just politely say, "Look, Nathan, we don't have time to answer all your detailed questions. If you want to know more, then you should look into studying botany or ecology."
Mhm.
And I think it was their way of really trying to get me out of their hair, to be honest. But I guess in the end, I kind of took them literally because I ended up eventually studying ecology in the subfield of
Right.
evolutionary ecology.
Interesting. And I would say you were doing science all along. Like if you were doing cheese making, of course you were doing science, right? If you're doing horticulture, you were doing science, but maybe not within the confines of academia so
Yes,
much.
definitely.
Yeah.
That's a nice way to think about it for sure. Yeah.
And as you were circling back into science, did you face any obstacles or have any particularly supportive mentors that helped guide you in your career?
Yeah, totally. That's something that has been, I think, crucial in informing my career. I think that really what attracted me to evolution in the first place was this whole asking why questions. I found in evolution that this is something that's encouraged and celebrated. It's really what drives the whole field. And I remember when I was a child that I was always asking my mum and dad, like, why this, why that? And they would brush off my questions exactly the same as my teachers did.
Mm.
And they would just, sort of dismissively say things like, oh, why is a crooked letter and you can't make it straight? And the things that parents say to their kids. So yeah, I feel like I often got this feedback in my early years that asking why questions was kind of annoying or inconvenient.
Mm.
But it was really, I found a home in evolutionary biology for this incessant curiosity. And it turns out that it's a really extremely powerful and useful way to answer these kinds of questions. And it was really my supervisor that encouraged me to pursue this direction.
That's great. And
In
I always love
terms,
to give a shout out to good supervisors. So who was that?
this was Russell Bonjuriansky
Oh,
at
great.
the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. But to answer your question more specifically, I suppose, about obstacles and hurdles, yeah, I think everybody does face these kinds of hurdles, but I suppose I don't really see them as obstacles, more like challenges.
Mm.
So one thing in particular was learning how to cope with criticism. It's the main
Ah,
thing
that's so
that
hard.
I really
Yeah.
struggled with. I mean, as a scientist, having your work criticized in a positive or sometimes not so positive way,
Hmm.
um, it just kind of comes with the territory, right? It's what we're used to. We
Hmm.
submit our work to be peer reviewed by other scientists. We present our work at conferences and we discuss our ideas with our colleagues and stuff. So criticism is really built into science. And I think it's there for a very good reason. It's how we improve the generation of our knowledge. But I feel like it's not really a natural way of being for humans. Um,
It puts
you
you
know,
on the defense, right? You feel threatened. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we kind of want to please people and belong to a group. We want to be nice and fit in. And learning how to cope with this kind of criticism is a really crucial part of the, scientific education. I remember one case of where this criticism really showed up strongly in my career was when I was presenting my PhD research at a prestigious conference. And I thought that my talk had gone really well, but that was not the view of the other members of the audience. And I got the harsh, really, really harsh questions and even heckles. There were people standing up in the
Mm.
audience with their arms in the air saying, this is crazy. What are you talking about? And I was devastated by this. Like,
Yeah.
I tried my best to answer the questions. Even my supervisor thought that he was surprised by the amount of vitriol from the audience, and it was really difficult. I felt like everything that I had done was a disaster. It was a waste of time. I really just wanted to crawl into a hole and never show my face again. And I think that students have a similar experience when they first start out because, like I said, getting this kind of criticism isn't a natural thing for people.
Mm.
It's not something that comes naturally. And I
Mm.
think for many students, they experience this. They have imposter syndrome. They feel kind of useless when they get this kind of critical feedback. I see this with my own students. And as I say, I've experienced this myself. So, yeah, I guess if there are any listeners of yours out there who are students themselves, I guess I would want them to know that you're not alone in having these kinds of feelings. Like they're completely natural and understandable because it's not natural to receive this kind of criticism all the time. And you can work through it and it doesn't last forever. You do get a thicker skin. And I feel like I've come to that now.
Yeah, those are wise words. So I'm sure the audience would be curious, how did you get over that experience?
Yeah. And this is the key. I think this is key. The key thing was my supervisor. From his incredible and amazing support, he helped me to see the value of criticism in science, even negative criticism. So he said, like, strong pushback is evidence that your work is having an impact and it's triggering people to reconsider what they think that they've always known. And I think that can be the case sometimes, certainly, but I wouldn't say that that's a blanket rule. I think sometimes you can
Right.
you can certainly make mistakes. But anyway, his guidance and kindness was really what helped me to persist.
Yeah.
And I'm a really strong believer that if you don't have good people around you as a scientist, you're really going to struggle. I think this applies to anyone, really. You don't, not just scientists.
Sure.
Yeah, I kind of feel like we need good friends and mentors that we can lean on, people whose opinion that we trust and value, who can
Hmm.
hold space for us and be there for us when we need it. And, hopefully, I hope that one day I'll be able to return the favor,
Yeah.
and be there in the same way for other people, for my students, in the same way. Yeah.
I love that. Are there any aspects of your identity or lived experience that influence your science and the questions you ask? And if so, how do they have that influence?
Yeah, so the why questions, I suppose the curiosity that
Mhm.
drives me has been there from the very beginning. But I think also another part of me plays a role as well. As a queer person, I think that my identity and experience has probably affected how I approach my work and what I research, but I would say it's probably in more subtle and unconscious ways than in overt, obvious ways. So, like, I'm not studying queerness, for example, and I'm not
Mhm.
studying same-sex sexual behavior. So it's not as explicit as that. But I think knowing from an early age that you're different compared to everyone else and that you don't really fit in, it has an effect on you, whether you're aware of it or not. I think it affects your outlook, what motivates you, or where your attention is focused. And I think my experience of growing up queer is probably part of the reason why I'm interested in unusual things in biology, in things that don't fit the mold of so-called normal. And I think it's also part of the reason why a lot of my research focuses on the female side of the story rather than the male side of the story. The sides and perspectives that haven't traditionally had the focus. So for me, my approach just naturally is to question received wisdom on how to
Uh-huh.
do the way that for many queer people, that's how it goes. And to challenge what people might think the best thing to research is, yeah, identifying different angles that my research could take. I've never really been someone who just does the popular thing, and whether that's in my social life or in science, and there are
Uh-huh.
definitely popular research topics in science. I'm much
Yeah.
more interested in addressing, key gaps in knowledge that I
Hmm.
find to be interesting and worth pursuing. Yeah, I think these kinds of challenging perspectives, as you mentioned, these kinds of why questions, but other things as well. They're really valuable for helping science to progress forward. Obviously, assuming that there's science that and evidence that motivates these perspectives,
Sure.
that's obviously
Yeah.
very important. So yeah, I hope that my experience as a queer person has only enhanced the quality of my research and ideas.
So let's dive into your research. Why don't we start by having you tell our listeners about asexual reproduction and why it's important?
So, an asexual person is someone who has no sexual attraction to any gender. But what we're talking about here is the other form of asexuality, which is a way of producing offspring without sex, just to clear that up. So, sex is not the only way to reproduce. There are asexual forms of reproduction as well in nature that involve no sex cells, well, no union of sex cells, I should say. So, yes, sex is mostly the same everywhere. There is some variation, but asexual reproduction, it comes in many more different flavors. So the simplest form of asexual reproduction in nature is binary fission, which is how most, if not all, single-celled bacteria reproduce. So it involves the splitting in half of a single individual into two daughter cells that are identical to each other. And this is kind of a similar way to the way that cells in our body divide and repair by mitosis, but the processes are slightly different. The other type of asexual reproduction is vegetative reproduction. And this is really common in plants, and it occurs when new individuals develop from a vegetative part of the parent, like a bulb or a tuber or an outgrowth from the parent, but not from the sex cells. So onions and potatoes are a great example of this kind of reproduction. You can take a potato and plant it, and it will grow into a new plant. And then you harvest those potatoes, you take another one and you plant it, and it will grow into new plants, and they're all clones of the parent. There's no sex involved. Yeasts do a similar thing, except it's called budding. And also some animals can do this kind of reproduction, like starfish. If they have an arm that's severed, then that arm can sometimes develop into a new individual. The same thing happens with flatworms. If you cut them in half, you'll get two individuals developing. And then finally, there's the more complex form of asexual reproduction called parthenogenesis. And this occurs when an unfertilized egg develops spontaneously into a new individual without being fertilized by a sperm cell.
So
So
is
there
that
are a
the
number.
only form of asexual reproduction that includes sex cells?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. There are a number of different animals and plants that reproduce this way. So dandelions are an excellent example in plants. Many of them reproduce by parthenogenesis. And in animals, we find parthenogenesis very commonly in mayflies and stick insects. It's also a common reproductive mode in bees, ants, and wasps, where male offspring are produced asexually. And it also occurs in some vertebrates like lizards, fish, and snakes. That's a summary of asexual reproduction. What makes it interesting is another question.
Yes. So what does make it interesting?
There are a few things that make asexual reproduction biologically interesting. The first thing is that it's really common on some branches of the tree of life, but really uncommon on others. So as I mentioned, in single-celled organisms, asexual reproduction, almost 100% of those organisms reproduce that way. But among multicellular organisms like fungi, plants, and animals, it's much rarer. Some guesses range from 1 to 10% of species. And it's not really clear why that should be the case. The second thing about asexual reproduction, and this is especially the case with parthenogenesis in animals, is that yes, it's really uncommon, but from a theoretical perspective, it shouldn't be. Asexual reproduction should be everywhere. That's what theory predicts. It's much less costly than sexual reproduction. So in evolutionary biology, a trait that is less costly than an alternative one, it should be favored by natural selection, and therefore it should spread through a whole population or species, and the other trait should go extinct. So if asexuality has less costs, it should outcompete sex.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you tell us more about these costs?
The best way to think about this is in terms of why sex is costly in comparison to asexuality. And the reason that sex is costly has to do with the challenges of two individuals coming together in order to reproduce. So it's things like finding a compatible mate, mating with the right species, not catching an STI, you're having a higher risk of being eaten when you're engaged in mating, and so on and so on. These kinds of things are really large costs for sexual organisms. But perhaps the largest cost of all is called the twofold cost of males, or the twofold cost of sex. And the best way to think of this is in terms of the negative effect that males have on population growth. So if you think about an asexual population and it reproduces at the same rate as a sexual population, so they're producing the same number of offspring for every individual, that asexual population will grow twice as fast over the generations because all of the asexual individuals are females. And they're all producing offspring of their own. But in a sexual population, only half of the individuals are females. So only half of them are producing any new offspring for the next generation. The other half, the males, they don't produce any offspring of their own from their own bodies. They just donate sperm for fertilization. The crux of the cost here is that sex requires two individuals, but asex requires only one individual, but it produces the same outcome. So asexuality is a much, much more effective way to reproduce. And so it should be everywhere. And yet we find that it's not. And this has really troubled biologists for decades, if not 100 years. It's a major evolutionary puzzle, and there's still no easy answer to explain this paradox.
So that's so interesting. And the species that you study have both asexual and sexual reproduction in the same species, right?
Yes, exactly. They do. And the reason that I study these species is because they're really useful for addressing or trying to test questions about why sex versus asex, which one is the better strategy. So yeah, it turns out though that this paradox of sex, of thinking about sexual populations and asexual populations and which ones should outcompete each other, that this is not really the best way to think about this problem. There's a number of models, including some that I've worked on myself, theoretical models, that suggest that a facultative kind of reproduction is actually better than either only reproducing sexually or only reproducing asexually. So facultative just means that an individual can reproduce one way or the other depending on certain circumstances. So it's facultative in the sense that it's not something that is obligatory. The organism can either choose or it's determined by environment or certain conditions. This paradox can be thought about in a different way. And this kind of reproductive strategy of being able to reproduce one way or the other is actually more efficient than reproducing only one way or only the other. And the reason is because individuals that can do one or the other, that they're able to gain the best of both worlds. They can reproduce sexually when it's right for them, or asexually when it's a better option. So they're able to achieve the short-term benefits of reproducing asexually and the long-term sort of genetic benefits of reproducing sexually. And this paradox is even more intriguing and difficult to solve, I think.
Can you tell us more about the reproductive biology of the species you're currently working on?
So the species that I am currently working on and have done quite a bit of work on now is called the springbok mantis. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. But the first thing that's interesting about it is that it is a facultative parthenogen. So it does reproduce either sexually or asexually, depending on
Very
whether
cool.
the female mates. So if she
Yeah.
mates, then she receives sperm, she fertilizes her eggs, her offspring are sexually produced, both sons and daughters. But if she receives no sperm and she lays her eggs, those unfertilized eggs develop into all daughters that are clones of the mother, essentially.
That's so cool. So she has different options depending on whether she mates with the male or not. Very
Exactly.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So this is one of the advantages of this kind of a strategy. This species is also a sexual cannibal, which means that the female attacks and consumes the male, which can be beneficial for females and not so good if you're a male.
And how do we differentiate sexual cannibalism from just predation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sexual cannibalism does look a lot like predation, as you say, because the female is eating the male. And other types of cannibalism can be thought of like that. For example, sibling cannibalism, where brothers and sisters eat each other. This is quite common in some birds of prey, where the biggest chick will eat the smallest chick or the weakest one. So yeah, so that's quite obviously a case of predation. But the difference with sexual cannibalism is that it always occurs during a sexual interaction. So you can think of, a male is out there searching for a female. When he finds one, he approaches her, he tries to court her, he mounts her, mates with her, and then when he's done, he'll either leave or he'll stick around to make sure that no other male will turn up and mate with her and compete against his sperm. So with sexual cannibalism, it's at some point during this sequence of events that the female attacks the courting male. So the difference between sexual cannibalism and predation is that sexual cannibalism only occurs during the mating sequence, but predation occurs at any other time.
Okay. And can you tell us more about sexual cannibalism in these springbok mantids and how that contrasts with what is kind of commonly believed about sexual cannibalism in mantids?
Praying mantises are pretty famous for females, very strange fetish for eating males. Most people probably have a picture in their mind about what sexual cannibalism looks like in these critters. It probably goes something like this. A male is happily mating with a female when she suddenly turns around and starts chomping down on the male's head until he's just a headless corpse mating with this female. And this kind of cannibalism during sex is quite common in mantises. So it's not surprising really that females have this reputation for chewing off male faces. But the species that I work on, the springbok mantis, it does things a little bit differently in the bedroom. So when males of this species approach the females and they mount them to try to mate, the female refuses and tries to eat him instead. So
So it's
cannibalism
not
in
during mating like in the other
yeah,
species. Okay.
exactly. Cannibalism in this species occurs exclusively with no mating happening at all.
Interesting.
It's a purely binary outcome. Either the
Mhm.
pair mates when they encounter each other or the male is cannibalized, but
Hmm.
he doesn't get cannibalized during.
Why would it be different in this species than other species of mantids?
That's a great question. The short answer the short answer is we don't know. There are some ideas out there that suggest that the timing of cannibalism is determined by the selective pressure that causes the cannibalism to occur at that time. So eating males before mating, there's ideas out there that maybe the male is just a better meal than a mate for the female. And then there are other ideas that after the male has already mated with the female or is during mating, that maybe the reason that the male is eaten is because the female is engaging in what we call mate choice. So she's choosing to stop the mating from going further because she realizes that she would be better off with a different male, mating with a different male later. So she eats
Hmm.
him to try to prevent him from monopolizing the fertilizations. That's
Hmm.
another idea that's out there.
Interesting. And is it
Yes.
associated at all? Like, can those females who eat males during mating, are they able to reproduce asexually? Is there any association between being a facultative parthenogen?
Parthenogen. Yeah.
So being able to reproduce asexually and sexually and cannibalizing before the mating's begun.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as we know, this combination of traits of sexual cannibalism and parthenogenesis is quite unique. I'm not aware of this occurring in any other system. And so there is the possibility that, there's something that combines them together. So maybe these females of this springbok mantis, maybe they're able to cannibalize males without any mating because they don't need to mate. They can just clone
Right.
themselves. And that was a question that I was interested in addressing, and I ran a study to test that. It turns out that these females are not very good at reproducing asexually. So they produce an order of magnitude fewer offspring asexually than they do sexually. So about 10 times fewer offspring. So they're really not good at reproducing this way. They're always going to be better off mating than reproducing on their own. So selection is going to favor those females finding a mate rather than avoiding mating completely. So it looks like there's no connection really between, these two traits, between sexual cannibalism and parthenogenesis, at least in this system.
So, for the lucky males who don't get eaten by the females in this species, what happens afterwards? How does mating progress in the species?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. The thing about this kind of cannibalism, where you have cannibalism occurring with no mating taking place, there's the risk that the female could end up as an old virgin, never mating for her whole life. And that would be a really dumb thing to end up. So, so that was a question that I was really interested in trying to figure out. How do males even get to mate in this species if the female is so aggressive and is attacking and eating him without him even getting a chance to mate? What does he do? How is he able to actually pass on his genes? How is this species even existing, essentially? Yeah, so basically we discovered that males do it by fighting back against females. So when the female tries to attack the male wrestles the female in these really violent struggles that often end in the female being injured. And these
Oh,
injuries occur because the male stabs the female in the abdomen with the claws of his legs that he usually uses for catching prey.
oh my.
It's really not a happy story for these females at
No.
all, but it's a fantastic strategy for males because wrestling with the females, it greatly enhances their chance of mating and avoiding
Mm.
cannibalism.
Are there any just like peaceful matings in the species where nobody's attacking anybody anybody else?
It does happen. We have seen them, but they're not very common. So we have additional studies that we're currently undertaking that are investigating the consequences of these injuries in females.
Oh,
So we're interested in trying to understand whether the male actually benefits from injuring the female. He might benefit if the female changes her reproductive scheduling when she's injured. So if the male injures the female and then the female in response to having all of these stab wounds, if she's like, oh my God, I'm going to die very soon, I'm infected, I need to pump out all of my eggs as fast as I can before I die, then that would benefit that male because he would have higher relative fitness compared to other
you would get
males.
more fertilizations. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting.
So
Okay.
we're investigating questions, relating to that, which I think is really, really interesting. And we don't have the answers yet, but hopefully soon.
Yeah. We'll look forward to hearing the results. I want to ask you also, how has your research impacted the scientific community, and has it had societal implications as well?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about evolutionary biology is that it's more or less a pure science. There are some important applications like understanding the evolutionary spread of viruses and diseases, and the evolution of resistance to pesticides and antibiotics as well, for example. But for the most part, I think our research is curiosity driven. So we're trying to understand why nature is the way it is and why natural and sexual selection generates all the diversity that we see in the natural world. So I think judging evolutionary biology based on its impact on society isn't necessarily the best framework to appreciate the kind of work that we do. So I kind of think about evolutionary biology in a similar way to astrophysics. So astrophysicists are interested in understanding the origins of the universe and how it developed and, how stars collapse and evolve. And I think astrophysicists and evolutionary biologists, we have the same thing in common. We're both seeking knowledge for its own sake, not for how it can be used for this or that application. Yeah, I mean, sometimes pure research can have societal benefits. I think that's absolutely the case. But I don't think that it should necessarily be something that we focus on. Because I get this question quite a lot from people just in the street, who say, oh, what benefit does this have for society? And my research just doesn't go in that direction. Because there are two different types of research. There's pure research and there's applied research.
Yeah.
So I think a better way to really appreciate pure research is in terms of the incredibly interesting things that it tells us about our world. And to me, that's just as valuable and necessary as, finding cures for cancer.
Yeah. So I have another question. You talked about what a curious kid you were and how you had all these why questions and you were kind of discouraged from different areas, but found your place in evolutionary biology. And I'm wondering, what has your approach to asking questions contributed to your scientific community? Like, what questions did you ask that people hadn't thought to ask before?
Yeah, it's a great question. To answer that, I think I would go back to what really sort of triggered me into becoming interested in evolution in the first place. And that was, it was my PhD supervisor. I was enrolled in his evolution course and we had a lab-based class and he brought in these stick insects, which people were fascinated by because they just look cool. But he just casually mentioned that these guys can reproduce both sexually and asexually. And I was just floored. I was like, what? I've never heard of that in my life. How on earth do they do that? Why would they do that? It's so bizarre and weird. And that idea, why reproduce sexually, why reproduce asexually? Or why do both? It really got stuck in my head like an earworm in really in the best way possible. Yeah, and then in the end, I did my PhD on that question, and I worked on actually that same stick insect. But the thing that I did was, it was driven by a why question. Why do they do this? But I also sort of smashed it together with this other idea that I had been learning about in Russell's course, and this was sexual conflict. This was the idea that males and females do not have the same evolutionary interests. What's in the best interest of a male of the same species is not in the best interest of a female. And I smashed those two ideas together, and I wondered, maybe the reason that these females reproduce like this is because of sexual conflict. Like maybe sexual conflict has a role to play in determining these kinds of reproductive strategies. Yeah, so I think coming up with that idea was really quite novel. It hadn't really been thought about before. There was a little bit of research, but yeah, my PhD propelled that forward in a really exciting direction.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation.
No, thanks for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity actually to reach out to the rest of the non-science community and the science community to share the research and the knowledge, and hopefully to inspire other people as well in the process. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening. Thanks also to our production team, Isabel Espinoza, Lane Patton, and Daphne Trilliana. The music used in this episode is from I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.